It's back to Zambia and working at the farm once again. But it's never plain sailing at Askari Farm, where rats in the belfry and cows in the sitting room bring interesting challenges for Kieron to solve. Chapter 23. Showers of Shyte. After a hasty reunion and a plausible silence over my exploits, we landed back in Zambia, and it seemed all was forgiven. Jan's parents had left Zambia and returned to England. Shits that passed in the night, I say. It gave us respite from certain reprisal in that quarter. For the moment. It was back to Askari Farm. Bless my dear father Ted for his construction prowess. He'd got Ellison, the guy who built our garden shack, to create a bedroom that led up to a lounge kitchen. Trouble was, the bedroom was attached to the milking parlor. Talk about being on the job. I could direct procedures from the comfort of our nest. My new vehicle was a Bedford, a rollicking monster of a thing. Most of the workers were still at the farm, and by all accounts, Askari Farm had become a paying enterprise. It was, however, a bit strange living slap-bang next to the dairy. Milking, all done by hand, started about 3 in the morning, and I rarely raised myself for that occasion unless a crisis loomed. Our bedroom had no ceiling, so we could lie back and watch the rats commuting from the lounge to the rich pickings of the food store by racing along the wooden beams. It was an uncomfortable feeling, and the occasional dropping had to be flicked off our pillows. We decided to install a ceiling. In Zambia, that was impossible, so we bought a roll of thick brown tar paper. It was just wide enough to be tacked along the space of a beam, and soon we had a makeshift ceiling. And the rats? Well, they saw it as a better highway, and their nimble footsteps could be traced with ease. It also made a racket when they jumped from beam to paper like trampoline artists. I had to put a stop to it, so borrowed an air rifle and spent many a morning shooting at them through the paper. This went on for weeks. The paper started to sag and daylight could be seen through the growing number of pellet holes because the corrugated roof was decaying. One Sunday, a particularly resilient rat took to doing the foxtrot on the paper. Janice and I lay there looking up. I carefully loaded my rifle with a pellet and aimed. 3 or 4 shots, and it was still there, jumping every time I fired. It was like a game, shoot, jump, shoot, side skip, and so on. I could distinctly see its feet pressing on the paper directly above our heads. I loaded again, took careful aim, and pow! The rat jumped. I thought I'd scored a direct hit and waited for it to land. And land it did, heavily. So heavily that the whole ceiling gave way and showered us with 1,000,000 pellets of rat shit. No wonder the paper was sagging. Worse, the rat, still alive, fell directly between us and scurried into the bed, between our sheets. We were out in a flash, Jan screaming as this monstrous rodent brushed our legs. I whipped away the blankets and sheets, and it scurried away. The cure for the rat problem was poison, so baits were placed at strategic locations. This all sounds so simple, and the rats did go away for a while, but the kind of poison we used caused the creatures to race for water. The water was in a tank in the roof above the so-called lounge, which was 4 steps up from the bedroom. The tank was sealed, so the rats quietly died in our roof. Well, need I say any more? Soon, maggots began to drop between the wooden gaps, and we were starting to wonder about things. In the end, the problem was unsolvable, so we gave up. Apart from these minor difficulties, I began to think that farm life, particularly in Africa, was definitely for me. I loved animals. I had great freedom and felt that I would be there forever. So deep was my affection for animals that I took a personal interest in a creature named Whitey. The farm workers had special names for all of the cows, names like Lucky and VC-10, named after the airliner, because she was a top milker. Whitey was completely black with a white head, and all her offspring were identical. But late one day, she had broken a fence and wandered into a dry water hole a couple of miles from the dairy. She sank up to her belly, and I found her baying pitifully. When cows get themselves into these situations, they seem to have no will to live. They accept their plight and let themselves die. I couldn't let her die. I sat with her all night. I lit a fire and talked her through the night. I knew if I left her she would be dead by the morning. But she listened to me. Whitey did. With her doe-like eyes reflecting in the night, she gawked at this human and seemed to accept something. The next day the workers arrived and we managed to hoist her out. It was a battle, but she lived. Whitey was also a greedy pig who loved her food. In those times we had to take a truck to town and collect loads of chibuku residue, a byproduct of the local beer. It was a superb cattle feed and smelled like cooked oats. Mixed with concentrated cattle feed, it was an essential part of keeping our milk yields up during winter. I tell you this only because we had to prepare buckets of the mix the night before in readiness for the early morning start. The buckets were placed in rows, one in front of each milking bay, so the boys could tip the rations over the low, waist-high wall into the troughs. This parlour passage led to a set of double doors at the end which opened to our bedroom. We arrived back from the cinema late one night, and while Janice went into the front door, I grabbed a torch to go and start the generator for lighting. But I heard a noise and went to investigate. "Whitey!" I yelled. She'd broken the holding fence and was busily scoffing the buckets full of chibuku. I had discovered her at the opposite end of the passage, and when she saw me, she began a slow reversal, kicking buckets over as she went. It was almost pitch black, and my torch beam was weak. If Whitey continued, I could maneuver her into the paddock. But just as she reached the end of the passage, Janice opened our bedroom door to investigate. All she saw was Whitey's backside. Like an avalanche, the cow continued its reversal into our bedroom and panicked. Janice clung to me. Whitey spun in circles looking for a way out. Her tail lifted and out came cascades of steaming green-brown liquid. She climbed onto the bed and spun in circles like a fireman spraying out a fire. There was cow shit everywhere, and Whitey even managed to get up the 4 stairs into our lounge, where she continued her panic-induced spray painting. We got a grip of ourselves and I rushed out to start the generator. It was, as they say, not a pretty sight. By now, Whitey was standing in the corner of my lounge chewing cud and leaning on our record player. We got her out through the front door, and she ran for freedom. Midnight was not a good time to clean up. We needed an army to sort this lot out, so closed up and headed for town to stay with my brother Sean. To me, Sean represented a stability that seemed to elude my own nomadic cravings, intended or not. He had a good job on the local mine and seemed able to maintain everything he needed: a Land Rover, money in the bank, and a commitment to his destiny. And, naturally enough, a gun. Still shooting all that moved. I suppose I should have known he would make it because his toys had always been the cleanest and best kept. Little piles of dinky cars that Michael always tried to steal. Sean spent a lot of time at Askari Farm with me. As I was driving beside a field of my ripening maize one day, the sky was its usual deep blue, with perfect puffs of white cloud scattered towards the horizon. There was a stillness about the place. I could smell the healthy green maize leaves and see the golden hairs of fruit emerging with the promise of a good season. The soil was rich and red and the day warm, not hot. I stopped and sat on the bonnet of the old truck. I could see for miles. I was 21 years old, and I had a sense that I had arrived at where I needed to be. I never wanted to leave. I was physically moved to tears because of it, and every one of my senses and all of the nature about me seemed to merge in one quixotic emotion. I vowed that day that I would never leave Africa. Never. There were forces at play. Just as the farm was starting to pay, the desperately inefficient leaders of Zambia had other plans. Sanctions against South Africa and Rhodesia put the stoppers on fertilizer imports. That, coupled with the closure of other local farms, put us in a position where dairy farming had become almost pointless at such an isolated place. Zambian radio news always began with "President Kaunda today said," followed by some dreadful litany of triumph over the colonial oppression of Rhodesia and South Africa. Zambia was fast deteriorating due to a suicidal policy of Zambianization. Bold and magnanimous as it seems, corruption, nepotism, and land grabbing was rife. The deterioration of that sad country was creeping upon us, and the death of serious farming was signaled by the closure of the government receiving station. They turned it into a biscuit factory. Thereafter, milk had to be delivered to the end of our road where a truck, always late, would take the milk-filled churns to Lusaka over 100 miles away. It usually arrived as cheese. Gradually, the farms diminished as veterinary supplies, fertilizer and fuel became rationed. It was soon after this that things began to go awry.